Daddy, she was singing while she did it. Those 6 words stopped James Montgomery cold in the doorway of his children's room at 3 a.m. A man who had never once in 15 years been stopped cold by anything. His son Leo said it like a question and a confession, at the same time knees pulled to his chest, voice barely above a whisper. And there she was, Claire Bennett, the quiet, forgettable nanny he'd barely spoken 10 words to, kneeling on the floor, a blade still warm in her hand, a Russian enforcer dead behind her, singing, softly, without apology, without explanation, like she'd done it 100 times before. If this story already has your heart pounding, subscribe right now, follow every part to the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Daddy, she was singing while she did it. Well, James Montgomery heard those words a full 3 seconds before his brain was able to process what his eyes were seeing. That gap, 3 seconds of pure white incomprehension, was the longest 3 seconds of his life. And James Montgomery had lived through some long seconds. He was standing in the door frame of his children's bedroom, barefoot, pistol in his right hand, heart slamming against his ribs at a frequency that had nothing to do with running and everything to do with dread, the specific, stripped, raw dread of a father who has already lost one person he loved more than his own life and will not survive losing another. His son Leo was sitting up in bed with both knees pulled to his chest, 7 years old, and already talking like someone who had seen too much of the world. His daughter Lily had both hands pressed over her mouth. Her eyes were enormous. She wasn't crying. She was past crying. She was somewhere past the place where crying lives. And Claire Bennett, the quiet, forgettable woman who had arrived 8 weeks ago, with one suitcase and no small talk, the woman James had hired because she came with a file that said exceptionally calm under pressure, and he'd needed someone who could hold a grieving house together without needing to be held herself. Claire Bennett was kneeling on the floor beside Leo's bed, her hand resting gently on the edge of his mattress, and behind her, flat on his back, on the hardwood floor, was a man, a large man, wide-shouldered, dressed in tactical black, with the blade buried precisely in the side of his neck. And she was humming, low, steady, something without words, something that moved through the room the way a hand moves across a frightened child's back. She turned when she heard James. She looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a colleague across an operating table, composed direct, transmitting information without transmitting apology. He came through the east window, she said. The latch has been weak for 2 weeks. I flagged it. James's mouth opened. Nothing came out. There was a second one, she continued. He's in the garden. He won't be getting up. Who? James started. That. Leo's voice, small, urgent. She just did it, and she didn't even stop humming. Leo. James crossed the room in 4 steps and put his hand on his son's head. And the world, the empire, 15 years of carefully constructed empires there dissolved completely. There was only his boy's hair under his palm and the smell of the room and the dead man on the floor. I'm right here. I've got you. She killed him, Dad. I know, son. She killed him, and then she started singing to us. James looked at Claire over his son's head. Claire held his gaze and said nothing. There was something in her expression that was not coldness. It was something more particular than coldness. It was the face of someone who has made a decision and is finished second-guessing it. Were you scared? Lily asked. She directed the question at Claire with the unfiltered precision that belongs exclusively to 7-year-olds and very old priests. No, Claire said. Why not? Because I was focused on keeping you safe. She said it simply without performance. You can't be scared and focused at the same time. You have to choose one. Lily stared at her for a long moment. Then, with the gravity of a child who had been sitting beside her mother's hospital bed for 6 weeks and had long since stopped accepting easy answers, she nodded. Once, slowly, filed it away somewhere deep. James straightened. He looked at Claire and said low enough that only she could hear it. My study, 5 minutes. Don't leave this floor until my men are on it. He stepped into the hallway and made 3 calls in under 90 seconds. By the 4th minute, 6 armed men were moving through the house. By the 5th, the garden was being swept. The east wing was on lockdown. And James Montgomery was sitting behind his desk in his study, staring at a glass of scotch he hadn't touched, trying to locate the version of himself that knew how to function. Claire walked in. She closed the door. She sat down across from him without being invited. That small act, sitting without invitation, told him more than the next 10 minutes of conversation would. Talk, James said. Viktor Petrov, Claire said. The name landed in the room like a stone in still water. James didn't move, but something behind his eyes shifted the way a massive submerged thing shifts when something disturbs the surface above it. I know that name. Then you know he runs the East Coast arm of the Bratva out of Brighton Beach. You know he's been expanding for 18 months. What you don't know, she paused, is why your children are the target. Enlighten me. Your wife, Catherine. She watched his face. Before she was Catherine Montgomery, she was Catherine Vasiliev. Her grandfather built the first Bratva cell in Brooklyn in 1971. James's jaw tightened. I knew she had a complicated family history. I married her anyway. Get to the part that explains the dead man on my children's floor. Viktor Petrov is dying, Claire said. Bone marrow failure, leukemia. He's been through 3 rounds of treatment. All failed. He needs a genetic match, a very specific one. She paused one beat. Your children carry the Vasiliev bloodline. They are the closest living match to Petrov's profile on this continent. His doctors gave him 4 months. He spent 2 of them finding Leo and Lily. The silence that followed had physical weight. James felt it on his chest, pressing down the way grief presses. He wants to harvest bone marrow from my 7-year-old children. James said it flat, quiet. Each word articulated with the kind of control that lives right at the edge of something that isn't control at all, from one, whichever is the stronger genetic match. And the child, at their age, under his conditions, with the speed he requires. Claire didn't look away. He isn't planning to return whoever he takes. James stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't throw anything. He didn't do any of the things that lesser men would have done in that moment. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the room, his hands clasped behind him, every muscle in his back locked rigid, and he breathed through his nose. 1, 2, 3. And outside the window, the city was enormous and indifferent and glittering. And somewhere in that glitter was a yearning man willing to tear apart a child to buy himself another 6 months of life. How do you know all of this? James said. Because I was sent to find out. He turned, slow, precise. By whom? By people with a shared interest in stopping Petrov before he unravels 3 years of carefully maintained infrastructure along this coast. People who needed someone on the inside of this house before he made his move. She met his eyes. I'm not your enemy, Mr. Montgomery. I was placed here to protect your children and gather intelligence. Both of those things are still true. You were spying on me. I was watching a threat approach from the direction you weren't looking. That's a careful answer. You want a soldier's answer. I want an honest one. She looked at him steadily. I was watching your house because someone had to. And while I was watching your house, I was also keeping your children alive. Those 2 things happened simultaneously, and I don't apologize for either of them. James studied her for a long, quiet moment. The thing that cut him deepest, deeper than the dead man upstairs, deeper than Petrov, deeper than the revelation that someone had been living under his roof with a double agenda, was that he believed her. His instincts built over 15 years in rooms where dishonesty was the primary currency were telling him clearly she is not lying. He hated that, and he was grateful for it. Both at once. Who trained you, he said. Does it matter right now? It matters to me. A beat. 5 years with a private intelligence contractor under State Department cover in Eastern Europe. Before that, military. Before that, nothing you'd find in any public record. She said it without drama, just data delivered clean. I speak 4 languages. 2 of them are languages Petrov's men use when they believe no one significant is listening. I've been inside his operation. I know his methodology. Then you know tonight wasn't the real move. Tonight was a probe, she said. He was testing your perimeter, measuring response time, checking coverage. He wanted to know exactly how protected you are before he sends the real team. She leaned forward slightly. He'll send 22 men, minimum. Not tonight, you're alert armed and he knows it. He'll move in the next 72 hours at the exact moment he calculates you've exhaled. And he'll come from inside, James said. Claire went still. James's voice dropped another register. That's what you haven't said yet. That's the part you're measuring how to deliver. She looked at him for one long second. Yes, she said. He doesn't just breach from the outside. He uses someone already trusted, someone already inside. The east window, James said. The weak latch, the maintenance report. He said each phrase like he was placing the items on a table one by one, building towards something he didn't want to build toward. Who files my maintenance reports? The silence lasted 4 seconds. Claire didn't answer. She didn't need to. The answer was already assembling itself in the air between them. Ralph McAllister, James said. He said the name the way you say the name of someone you love when you have just learned they're gone. Ralph McAllister, 9 years. The man who had sat across from him at 3 in the morning when the diagnosis came through and helped him figure out how to tell the children their mother was sick. The man who had organized the security detail for the funeral without being asked because he'd known James would not be capable of thinking about logistics that week. The man who had stood at the grave shoulders, square jaw tight, carrying the weight of the casket with both hands. He was a pallbearer, James said. I know, Claire said quietly. That's precisely what makes it effective. James sat down. He said nothing for a full 60 seconds. Claire didn't fill the silence. She had the intelligence, the particular emotional intelligence, of people who have worked in difficult and broken places to understand that some silences need to be occupied before they can be crossed. When James spoke again, his voice was somewhere between a whisper and a warning. Where is Ralph right now? His car left the property at 11:45 p.m., Claire said. He told your gate security he was picking something up for his daughter's birthday. James looked up. His daughter's birthday, Claire said, is in March. The room turned cold. I want confirmation, James said. Before I move on a man who carried my wife to her grave, I need to be certain. By the time you have certainty, Claire said, Petrov will have Leo and Lily's blood type confirmed and a surgical team on standby. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You don't have the luxury of certainty right now, Mr. Montgomery. You have the luxury of speed. I don't move on men I've trusted for 9 years on the word of a woman I've known for 8 weeks. Even if that man used your grief as a door. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. Even if every moment of loyalty you witnessed was a performance calculated for exactly this night. The question didn't land like a question. It landed like a blade, placed precisely, without apology. James stared at her. You are very direct, he said finally. You strike me as someone who can hold it. I can hold it. His eyes didn't move from hers. I'm deciding right now whether I can trust it. And something crossed her face then, not warmth, not calculation, but something in the narrow space between those two things. Something that acknowledged without performance the specific difficulty of asking a man to trust a stranger in the same night a trusted man became a stranger. Fair enough, she said, and she meant it. Every syllable. James stood. He walked to the window one final time. The city burned quietly below him, enormous and uncaring, and somewhere in it, Ralph McAllister was sitting across from a dying man and selling 2 children for whatever price his conscience had finally settled on. 3rd floor goes to full lockdown, James said. No movement without my direct authorization. 2 men on the children's door, 2 at the base of the stairs, 2 at the east wing corridor. He paused. And I want cameras on Ralph's car, every road in and out of this city. Already arranged, Claire said from behind him. Marcus has it. He turned. You called Marcus before I did. While you were walking down the hall. A long beat. You have good instincts, she said. You just need to trust them faster. She moved toward the door. Claire, she stopped. James stood with his back still half turned to her, and when he spoke, the question came out in a register he almost never used, not the voice of the feared man, not the voice of the empire builder, not the measured tone he deployed in rooms where lives were decided. Something older than all of that. Something that lived underneath all of that. The singing, he said, while he was dying on the floor, while my children were watching. Wait. The pause was long enough to be real, because they were awake, Claire said, and they were terrified. And a song reaches a frightened child faster than any explanation ever will. She rested her hand briefly on the doorframe. And because in that moment, in that exact moment, I needed to remind myself that what I was doing was worth the cost of doing it. She walked out. James stood alone in his study, Florence on his wall, scotch on his desk, the city burning below him. Above him, behind two locked doors with armed men, at every angle his children were being sung back to sleep by a woman who had just killed for them without hesitation and without theater. And somewhere in the dark, in the glitter, and the cold October streets, Ralph McAllister, pallbearer, consigliere, 9 years of trusted mornings, was making a phone call to a dying man who wanted to crack his children open for their bones. James Montgomery unclenched his hands. He picked up his phone. He did not call Ralph, not yet. He called his lawyer, his accountant, his head of operations, and his most trusted captain in that order, and said the same 4 words to each of them: "Find out what Ralph knows." Then he set the phone down, poured the scotch into the sink, and stood in the silence of his study and understood, with the cold and total clarity of a man who has just had the floor torn out from under him, that grief had made him blind. And blindness in his world was not a tragedy. It was an invitation. And Victor Petrov had just walked through it. The 4 calls took 11 minutes total. James Montgomery did not raise his voice on a single one of them. That was the thing about real power. It didn't need volume. It needed precision. And in the 11 minutes between hanging up from his lawyer and setting the phone face down on his desk, James had begun the quiet surgical process of dismantling everything Ralph McAllister had ever touched. Not visibly, not yet. That was the discipline. You didn't move until you knew exactly how far the rot had spread. You didn't amputate until you understood what else the infection had reached. He spent the next hour alone going through files. Not the digital ones; those could be monitored, manipulated, accessed from the outside by someone who knew what they were doing. The paper files. The ones in the fireproof cabinet behind the bookcase that only 3 people in the world knew existed. Him, his wife, and Ralph McAllister. He opened the cabinet and stood there staring at it for a long moment before he began pulling folders. Ralph had access to everything: operational logistics, property records, the children's school schedule, medical records, dietary restrictions, blood type. James felt the bottom of his stomach drop when he reached that last folder, the one from the pediatrician's office, the routine blood work from 8 months ago, the one that had been filed here because Catherine had been meticulous about keeping hard copies of the children's health records, because she'd grown up in a family where information was a weapon and she wanted it kept close. Blood type, right there, in black ink, filed in a cabinet that Ralph McAllister had a key to. James closed the folder. He set it on the desk. He pressed both palms flat on the surface and stood there breathing. Then the door opened without a knock. "You need to see this." Claire stepped in, phone extended. On the screen was a photograph, grainy shot from what looked like a traffic camera timestamp reading 12:23 a.m. A car parked outside a restaurant in Brighton Beach. Ralph's car. And beside it, barely visible at the edge of the frame, a black Mercedes with plates James didn't recognize, but that he was already certain he could trace. Brighton Beach, James said. 14 minutes from this property. He didn't even bother to drive far. He didn't think he needed to. Claire set the phone on the desk. He thought tonight would end differently. James looked at the photograph for another moment, then set the phone face down beside the folder. "How many people in my organization know about the blood work?" Claire paused. "More than you'd want to know right now." "How many?" "Ralph had access to the pediatric file. He also had access to your wife's full medical history from the 2 years before she passed." She said it carefully, not callously, but without wrapping it in softness that would slow them down. Petrov's medical team wouldn't have needed much. Blood type, the Vasiliev genetic line, a basic profile. Ralph gave them enough to confirm the children were viable matches months ago. This wasn't a decision made this week. "How long?" James said. Claire met his eyes. "We believe he made first contact with Petrov's people approximately 5 months ago." 5 months. James did the math without wanting to. 5 months ago, he'd been 3 months out from Catherine's death. He'd been barely functional. He'd been the version of himself that sat in this study for 6 hours at a time without moving, that forgot to eat, that had to be reminded by his housekeeper that his children needed to see his face. He'd been, for the first and only time in his adult life, genuinely, completely vulnerable. And Ralph had known. Ralph had been there. Ralph had sat across from him in this very room and said, "Take whatever time you need, James. We've got it covered." They had it covered, all right. 5 months, James said. The words came out with no emotion at all, which was the most dangerous sign. James, don't. His voice was quiet, absolute. Don't soften it. Don't manage me. Just tell me what we're walking into. She straightened slightly, adjusted to him. Petrov's medical team is currently staged in a private facility in Southampton. Converted residential property, 12 rooms of basement level with surgical capacity. He's had it operational for 6 weeks. The team is 8 people, 4 medical, 4 security. He was waiting for confirmation that acquisition was viable before he moved the surgical timeline forward. She paused. Tonight's probe was the last piece. By tomorrow morning, his people will know the probe failed. They'll know the house is on alert. At that point, Petrov has 2 options. He retreats or he accelerates. He accelerates, James said immediately. Yes. Because he's dying and he's out of time, and a man with nothing to lose doesn't retreat. James pushed back from the desk and stood. Which means we have a smaller window than 72 hours. Significantly smaller. My estimate is 36 hours before he moves to a direct extraction attempt. And this time it won't be 2 men through a window. She looked at him steadily. He'll come in numbers, and he'll use Ralph to coordinate the approach from inside. Ralph doesn't know we know. Not yet. James looked at her. Can we use that? Something shifted in her expression, a fractional sharpening, the kind that happens when a person recognizes they're talking to someone who thinks the way they think. Yes, she said, but it requires letting Ralph believe he's still running his play, which means you can't move on him directly. Not yet. You have to let him make his next contact with Petrov's people and feed them exactly what we want them to believe. You want to use Ralph as a channel. I want to use Ralph as a weapon, she said. His. Turned around. James was quiet for a moment. There were exactly 2 things in this situation that could go wrong if they ran the play she was describing. One was Ralph panicking and going dark before they could use him, and the other was something going wrong with the children in the window of time it took to set it up. The children, he said, already moving. She pulled out her phone and showed him a second image. This one a live feed the hallway outside Leo and Lily's room, 2 of his best men visible at the door. I've also arranged for a secondary location. A property Petrov's people have no record of, not in any file Ralph ever accessed. I can have the children move there within the hour. Who owns it? I do, Claire said. James stared at her. It's registered under a name that doesn't connect to me, to you, or to anyone in either of our circles. It has its own security infrastructure. It's where I go when I need to disappear. She held his gaze without blinking. I'm offering it to you. To them. The weight of that landed differently than James expected. Not because it was a grand gesture, Claire Bennett did not deal in grand gestures, but because it was the opposite. It was a person handing over the one thing they kept entirely for themselves. The one exit, the private door. You're sure, he said. I'm sure I'm not willing to let those 2 kids get taken while we're running a counter operation, she said simply. So yes, I'm sure to them. James nodded, once. Move them in 20 minutes. I want to be the one who tells them. He went upstairs. Leo was still awake. James had known he would be. Leo had his mother's brain. It didn't stop running just because the situation demanded rest. He was sitting against the headboard with the lamp on the old book Claire had been reading them open on his lap. But he wasn't reading it. He was just staring at it. James sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't speak for a moment. He just sat there the way his own father had never sat with him, the way he'd learned to sit with his children by watching Catherine do it with patience, with presence, without the constant gravitational pull of everything else. You're not going to sleep, James said. No, Leo said. Do you want to ask me something? Leo looked at him, his mother's eyes, his mother's particular steady way of looking at a person. Is the man who sent those people coming back? James held his son's gaze. He had a policy one Catherine had insisted on, and that he'd maintained since her death of not lying to his children about danger. Softening it, yes. Framing it carefully, yes. But not lying. They'd had too much lying in their lives already from the world, from the nature of their father's work, from the way adults around them spoke in lowered voices and changed the subject when they walked in. He might try, James said, but we're not going to let him. Claire won't let him, Leo said with the absolute confidence of a child who has decided where their faith lives. James looked at his son for a moment. No, he said quietly. She won't. I knew she was different, Leo said. From the first week. She doesn't talk to us the way people talk to kids whose mom died. She just talks to us. James didn't answer that. He didn't have an answer that would fit in this conversation without breaking something. He pressed his hand once against the back of his son's head and stood up. I need you and your sister to go with Marcus tonight, he said, to a different house for a little while. Because the man might come back. Because I'm going to make sure he can't. And I need to know you're somewhere safe while I do that. Leo thought about this with the same seriousness he brought to every decision. Then, will Claire be with us? James paused at the door. For part of it, he said, which was the most honest answer he could give. 22 minutes later, his children were in a car with Marcus and two other men James trusted with his own life, moving through the city toward a property registered under a name that appeared in no database Ralph McAllister had ever opened. James watched the taillights disappear through the front gate. Then he went back and said to Claire, now tell me exactly how we feed Ralph what we need him to pass on. They worked for 3 hours straight. No food, no breaks, nothing but the specific methodical work of constructing a lie sophisticated enough to fool a man who had spent 9 years watching James Montgomery construct exactly this kind of strategy. It had to be credible. It had to be tight enough that there was no room for Ralph's instincts to find a gap. And it had to arrive through a channel that felt natural, not pushed at him, not dropped in his lap, but discovered. The way information felt real was when a person thought they had found it themselves. He's going to call in the morning, Claire said. He'll act normal. He'll pretend last night didn't happen, and he'll look for your reaction. I know how he operates. Then you know he's going to be measuring every word you say for signs that you know. And I'm going to give him none. James looked at her. I've been sitting across from men who are lying to me since I was 19 years old. I know what it costs to show nothing. I'm willing to pay it. She studied him for a moment. He was your friend. He made a choice. That doesn't mean it doesn't cost you. James looked at her for a long moment. There was something disarming about the way she said it, not as softness, not as therapy, but as plain acknowledgement. The way a soldier acknowledges another soldier's wound without making it the center of the operation. It cost me, he said finally. I'll pay it later. She nodded. That was enough. At 4:47 a.m., James's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered it on the second ring. Mr. Montgomery. The voice on the other end was accented not heavily but precisely. Eastern European shaped by years in American rooms. Careful. Controlled. My name is not important. What is important is that we share a mutual problem. James said nothing. He let the silence do its work. The man you lost tonight, Ralph McAllister. I want you to know that his arrangement with my employer was not sanctioned by me personally. I am calling to propose that we avoid any further. Who is your employer? James said. A pause. I think you already know. I want to hear you say it. Another pause. Longer. Victor Petrov. And what does Victor Petrov want from me at 5 a.m? A conversation. A reasonable conversation between two men who both understand the value of their families. The voice was smooth. Practiced. This was a man who had made calls like this before. Mr. Petrov is unwell. He is a grandfather. He is a man who built something from nothing, as you did, and he is running out of time. He believes there is a solution here that serves everyone. He sent men through my children's window, James said. The restraint in his voice was extraordinary. It was the restraint of a man holding a live wire without letting it show on his face. That was a miscommunication. Mr. Petrov deeply regrets. Tell Mr. Petrov, James said, and now the restraint dropped exactly 1 degree. Just enough to let the thing underneath breathe through, that when I'm ready to have a conversation, I'll initiate it. He paused. And tell him the next person he sends to my property will not be found. He ended the call. Claire was watching him from across the room. They're scared, James said. They're recalibrating, she said. Petrov didn't authorize that call. Someone in his organization made it without permission because they're afraid of what you'll do next. That's the probe felling. That's the disorganization that comes after. She straightened. But Petrov himself won't recalibrate. He'll double down. He always doubles down when he's afraid. That's his pattern. How do you know his pattern? Because I spent 8 months inside his operation in 2019, she said, in St. Petersburg, under a different name. James looked at her. There were so many questions in that sentence that he didn't know which one to pull first. "You'll tell me all of that," he said. "Later." "Yes," she said. The morning came gray and cold, and with it came Ralph McAllister's call at 8:14 a.m., exactly as Claire had predicted. James answered it in the kitchen with a cup of coffee in his hand and nothing on his face. "Morning, James. Hell of a night, I heard Marcus briefed me. You doing okay?" The warmth in Ralph's voice was extraordinary. If James hadn't known, if he hadn't sat in his study at 3 in the morning, staring at the photograph of Ralph's car outside a restaurant in Brighton Beach, he would have heard nothing in that voice but genuine long-built concern. "It was handled," James said. "The nanny," Ralph said, and there was something very careful tucked inside the casual. "Marcus said she was something else. She handled herself." "Where'd she come from again?" "What agency?" There it was, tucked into a natural question in a natural place in a natural tone. 9 years of watching James operate had made Ralph very, very good at extracting information in the space where information felt like small talk. "Can't remember off the top of my head," James said. "I'll have someone pull the file." He paused. "You coming in today? I want to go over the Southampton property logistics." A fractional hesitation. So small that anyone who hadn't been listening for it would have missed it entirely. But James had been listening for it. "Southampton," Ralph said. "Catherine had some outstanding estate matters I've been putting off. Figured it's time." James said it evenly, just a man dealing with ordinary business. "Come in around noon. We'll go through it." "Sure," Ralph said. "Yeah, noon works." He hung up. James set the phone down. Claire was standing behind him. She'd heard every word. "Southampton," she said quietly. "Let's see what he does with it," James said. What Ralph did with it was make a phone call 40 minutes later from a payphone 3 blocks from his apartment. Something Claire's contact flagged within minutes through a cell tower trace on the phones adjacent to the location. A payphone. In an age when nobody used payphones, a man using a payphone had exactly one reason to use a payphone. He was talking to someone he couldn't afford to have on his personal records. "He took the bait," Claire said. "He took the bait," James agreed. But there was nothing in his voice that sounded like victory. There was only the sound of a man who has confirmed the thing he most hoped was wrong and is now standing on the far side of that confirmation, looking at what it means. Ralph McAllister had been his friend for 9 years, and for at least 5 of them, possibly longer. Some part of what Ralph McAllister was had been turned toward this moment, toward the quiet, patient work of selling the children of a man who trusted him to a dying criminal who wanted to mine them for parts. James stood up. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his phone and called Marcus. "How are they?" he said. "Leo's eating breakfast," Marcus said. Lily made him read to her from that book." "They're okay, boss." "Good," James paused. "Keep them there." He hung up. He looked at Claire. "Noon," he said. "When Ralph walks in that door, I need everything in place." "It will be," she said. "And when this is over," he stopped. He looked at her with something that wasn't quite what he was used to feeling, something that didn't have a clean name in the vocabulary of a man who had lived his entire adult life inside the grammar of power and control. "When this is over, we're going to have a longer conversation." Claire held his gaze. "About what specifically about who you really are," James said. "And what happens now?" She was quiet for a moment. "Then I'll be here." And James Montgomery, who had not slept in 11 months, who had buried his wife and rebuilt his empire and watched his children scream in the dark, walked back toward the storm that was coming. Ralph McAllister would walk through that door in 3 hours. And Victor Petrov, dying in a medical bunker in Southampton, was about to find out what happened when you reached into the wrong man's house. Ralph McAllister walked through the door at 11:58 a.m., 2 minutes early, which was exactly what a man trying to look normal would do. James was already seated behind his desk when Ralph came in, the same desk he'd been sitting behind for 15 years, the same chair, the same posture, back straight, hands visible. Expression arranged into something that read as tired but functional. The face of a man who'd had a rough night and was pushing through it. He'd practiced the arrangement of it in the bathroom mirror at 9 that morning, not because he needed the practice, but because he needed to know it was right. Because Ralph would be looking for cracks, and there could not be a single one. "You look like hell," Ralph said, and dropped into the chair across the desk, the way he always dropped into that chair, familiar, proprietorial, The body language of a man who'd been in this room so many times, it felt like his own. Feel like it, James said. He picked up the coffee mug on his desk and drank from it. His hand was completely steady. You eat yet? Yeah, grab something on the way. Ralph leaned forward, forearms on his knees, the posture of engaged concern. Talk me through last night. Marcus gave me the broad strokes, but I want to hear it from you. And this was the thing about Ralph McAllister, the thing that made him so effective, the thing that had made him trusted for 9 years. He was genuinely good at this. The concern in his voice was textured and specific, the way real concern is textured and specific, with the small details that perform sympathy don't bother to include. His eyes moved to James's face and stayed there the way a friend's eyes do not, the way a handler's eyes do. If James hadn't had the photograph, if Claire hadn't given him the cell tower trace, if he hadn't sat in his study at 3 a.m. looking at the blood type notation in his children's medical folder and understood exactly what it meant that Ralph had a key to that cabinet, he would have believed him. Even now, knowing everything he knew, some old and stubborn part of him wanted to believe him. That was the most brutal part of it. Not the betrayal itself, but the fact that the friendship had been real enough to leave a scar in the shape of trust. 2 men got through the east perimeter, James said. The window latch, the one Claire flagged in the maintenance report 2 weeks ago. They came through there. He watched Ralph's face. Nothing moved. Not a flicker. The man was extraordinary. The nanny handled them, Ralph said. She handled them, James said. Which tells me we've got a gap in the vetting process somewhere because I hired her as a nanny and she fights like someone I'd put on my own security detail. You want me to dig into her background? Run a deeper check? There it was again, tucked into helpfulness. The real question underneath, how much do you know about her and how much does she know about you already done? James said easily. She's clean, good instincts, good training, good heart. The kids trust her. He paused just long enough to be natural. Listen, the reason I wanted you here today, the Southampton property. Catherine had some estate paperwork attached to it that her lawyers have been sitting on. I want to resolve it before the end of the year. Ralph's expression shifted in a way that was too subtle to catch without looking for it, but James was looking for it. Had been looking for nothing else since Ralph sat down. A fractional tightening around the eyes, a micro-adjustment in his posture, a man recalibrating. What kind of paperwork? Ralph asked. Trust documentation. The property was supposed to transfer into the children's names at a certain point. Catherine set it up before she got sick. The lawyers need me present to authorize the final transfer. James leaned back. I was thinking this week. While things are unsettled here, maybe it's better to get the kids out of the city anyway. Take them out to Southampton. Handle the paperwork. Let everything cool down. The silence lasted 2 seconds. That's not a bad idea, Ralph said. His voice was perfectly modulated. And it was that perfection, that precise controlled modulation that James had spent 9 years reading as steadiness that confirmed everything. Because Ralph McAllister wasn't calm because he was composed. He was calm because he was calculating. The children. Southampton. A timeline accelerated. A dying man in a medical bunker who had just been handed exactly what he needed. I'll have my assistant reach out to the lawyers, James said. We'll aim for Wednesday. He picked up a folder from the desk and slid it across. In the meantime, I need you to look over these operational notes from the Brighton Beach situation. We've been watching some movement out there for the last few weeks. Tell me if anything looks familiar. Ralph took the folder, opened it. His eyes moved across the page. The folder contained real documents, real surveillance notes, real operational intelligence about Petrov's Brighton Beach network, but specifically curated, specifically constructed to tell a partial story that would be valuable to Petrov's people while leading them toward exactly the wrong conclusion about James's awareness of the Southampton facility. It had taken Claire 2 hours to put together. She'd done it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had assembled this particular kind of trap before in other cities for other operations with other lives in the balance. James had watched her work and understood with a clarity that surprised him that he was in the presence of someone who was genuinely exceptional at something very specific and very dangerous. Ralph read through the folder. He asked 3 questions, all of them intelligent, all of them designed to look like due diligence. James answered each one with exactly the level of detail that a man who trusted his consigliere completely would provide. When Ralph left 40 minutes later, he left believing he was ahead of the situation. He had his phone out before he reached the bottom of the front steps. Claire watched the feed from the external camera in the kitchen, arms crossed her expression, the flat, focused calm that James was beginning to recognize as her particular version of high alert. "He'll contact Petrov's people within the hour," she said, "and tell them we're bringing the children to Southampton on Wednesday," Mom said, "which means Petrov will move his surgical timeline to Wednesday." She turned to look at James, "which means we have until Wednesday morning to get inside that facility and end this." "We have until Tuesday night," James corrected. "I want it done before my children are anywhere near that timeline, even as bait." "Agreed." She paused. "I need to make a call. There are two people I trust who can be in position by tomorrow night. Former colleagues. They're not affiliated with your organization, which matters, because if there's a second leak somewhere in your structure—" "There isn't," James said. "You were certain about Ralph," she said, not cruelly, just accurately. James looked at her for a long moment. "Make your call," he said. She made it from the back garden out of the house, standing in the cold October air with the phone pressed to her ear. James watched her through the window, not because he was suspicious, but because watching her was becoming something he did without deciding, to the way you watch a fire, because fire is the only thing in the room that feels real. She came back in 10 minutes later and said, "They'll be in position by 9 tomorrow night. Former military, both of them. They know Petrov's operation. One of them was inside the Southampton facility 6 months ago on a separate contract." "Inside it," James said. "She was the one who first flagged it to my former employers as a potential threat." Claire met his eyes. "Her name is Sasha. She knows the layout. Entry points, guard rotations, the location of the medical suite in the basement level." She paused. "She also knows that Petrov keeps his personal physician close. A man named Dr. Brennan Irish, recruited out of a Dublin hospital 3 years ago under financial pressure. He's not there by choice. The doctor is a captive. The doctor is a man who made one terrible decision and has been paying for it for 3 years," Claire said, "which makes him a potential ally if we approach correctly." James absorbed this. "You have a plan." "I have the architecture of a plan," she said. "I need you to tell me how many men you're willing to commit, and I need to know with complete honesty whether you intend to be present." "I intend to be present," James said immediately. "I anticipated that answer. I want you to hear me when I tell you that your presence complicates the operation." "My presence ends the operation," James said. "Petrov doesn't die if I'm not in the room. That's not negotiable." Something moved through Claire's expression, something that might have been the beginning of an argument reconsidered in real time and converted into something else, a recognition. She'd worked with enough men like James Montgomery to understand that there were decisions that were made at a level beneath strategy, beneath tactics, in the place where a man's identity lives. You couldn't argue a man out of those decisions. You could only build the operation around them. "Then we build it so your presence is the last move," she said, "not the first." "Agreed." At 4 that afternoon, James's phone rang. The number was clean, a burner untraceable in the normal sense, but James's tech man had flagged the pattern of the call as originating from the same cell tower cluster as the payphone Ralph had used that morning. It was Petrov's man again. The same voice, Eastern European, careful. "Mr. Montgomery, I understand you're planning to visit your Southampton estate this week." James felt the ice move through his chest. So fast. Ralph had moved so fast. He'd barely been out the door 3 hours. "I will visit my estate frequently," James said. "Of course, a beautiful property, very private." A pause, measured and deliberate. "Mr. Petrov wanted me to convey that he considers Southampton a very comfortable location for a preliminary conversation. Neutral ground, in a manner of speaking." "Neutral ground," James repeated. "He's a reasonable man, Mr. Montgomery. He simply wants to talk." "And if I'm not interested in talking?" The pause that followed was different from the previous ones. Shorter, with less cushioning inside it. "Mr. Petrov has great respect for your children," the voice said, and the word respect in that sentence was doing something that had nothing to do with its definition. "He hopes that respect is mutual." James's hand tightened on the phone. "Just once. just for a second. Tell Mr. Petrov, I'll be in touch, he said, and ended the call. He sat without moving for 30 seconds. Then he said to the room, knowing Claire was within earshot, he's not waiting until Wednesday. She appeared in the doorway. What did they say? They know about Southampton. They're framing it as an invitation to talk, which means Petrov has already decided the timeline. He's using the conversation as cover. James looked at her. He's moving tomorrow night. Claire didn't hesitate. Then we move tonight. Your people aren't in position until 9 tomorrow. I'll call Sasha back. She can accelerate. Already moving toward the window phone in hand. She won't love it, but she'll do it. Is she reliable under compressed timelines? She's the most reliable person I know under pressure, Claire said, and there was something in her voice when she said it, a particular note, a weight that carried history that told James this wasn't a professional assessment. It was personal. She's also the only person outside this room who knows the full layout of that facility. James stood. Then we have 6 hours. Less, Claire was already dialing. Get your men ready. 3 maximum. This works on precision, not numbers. Petrov's security will be at full strength if they're moving the timeline up, which means we cannot afford a frontal approach. We go in the way Sasha went in 6 months ago, through the medical supply entrance on the north side, 2 guards rotating every 45 minutes. And Petrov will be in the basement medical suite, she said. He doesn't move from there anymore. He can't. The leukemia has progressed to the point where he needs the monitoring equipment constantly. She paused with the phone to her ear, waiting for Sasha to pick up. He's not a man in a fortress, James. He's a dying man in a hospital bed who's trying to buy himself more time by destroying your family. She looked at him. Remember that when you're standing in front of him? Because he'll try to make himself seem powerful. He'll try to make you feel like you're still playing his game. I stopped playing his game the moment I walked into my children's room last night, James said. Sasha picked up. Claire's entire register shifted. She switched languages mid-sentence, moving between English and something that might have been Russian or might have been something adjacent to it, clipped and rapid, and James stood and listened to the sound of a plan taking shape in a language he didn't speak. And he thought about his children eating breakfast in a safe house with Marcus Leo, reading aloud to Lily from the old book with the maps, and he let that image carry him through the next 30 seconds the way a current carries a swimmer, not by fighting it, but by using it. Claire hung up. She'll be there by midnight. She's bringing her partner. A pause. James, there's something else, something Sasha told me just now that she didn't have before. Tell me. Petrov's physician, Dr. Brennan, he's been smuggling information out of the facility for the last 6 weeks. Medical records, surgical plans, operational timelines. He's been sending them to a contact in Dublin, hoping someone would act on them. She met James's eyes. The contact in Dublin forwarded them to Sasha's former employer 3 weeks ago. That's part of why I was accelerated into this operation. Part of why the placement in your house was moved up. James went very still. What information specifically? The surgical timeline, the genetic match confirmation, the names of both children. She paused. And a third name, James, a name that wasn't in Petrov's original operational file, a name that was added to the target list 6 weeks ago. Whose name? Claire looked at him steadily. Yours. Petrov's original plan was to take one of the children, complete the procedure, and disappear. Clean, no confrontation. 6 weeks ago, that plan changed. He added your name to the list. He's going to try to kill me, James said. Not a question, not a revelation, just a man locating himself accurately in a situation. He's going to try to take you alive, Claire said. Long enough to sign over control of your East Coast operations to a proxy he controls. Then kill you. She paused. It was Ralph's suggestion. According to Brennan's notes, Ralph pitched the expanded plan to Petrov's people 40 days ago. The silence that followed was absolute. 40 days ago. James had been sitting in this office 40 days ago. He could place it exactly because 40 days ago he'd had a meeting with his lawyers about the estate, and Ralph had sat in the chair across from him for 2 hours reviewing documentation. And at one point James had looked up from a paper and found Ralph watching him with an expression he'd read as loyalty and had apparently been something else entirely. 40 days ago, while James was still learning how to sleep again, while Leo was still waking up 3 nights a week. While Lily had started leaving drawings of her mother on James's desk because she'd heard somewhere that drawing what you missed was supposed to help. 40 days. I want Ralph in this room by 9 o'clock tonight, James said. James, I know. He held up one hand. I know we need him out of contact until after we've moved on the facility. I know that confronting him now risks tipping Petrov. I know all of that. He lowered his hand. 9 o'clock. In this room. That's not negotiable either. Claire looked at him for a long, considering moment. All right, she said quietly, but I'm in the room. I wouldn't have it any other way. The call to Ralph was 3 sentences. James told him there'd been a development with the estate paperwork, asked him to come back in at 9, said it couldn't wait. Ralph said of course no problem, he'd be there. Same warm voice, same practiced ease. James set the phone down and stood in the quiet of his study, and the light was going out of the afternoon sky, and somewhere in Southampton, a dying man was rearranging a surgical timeline, and somewhere in the city, a woman named Sasha was getting in a car with a loaded bag and driving toward a facility she'd been inside before, and in a safe house that didn't exist in any database Ralph had ever accessed. Leo was reading to Lily from a book with maps and adventures and no tragedy. And Claire Bennett was standing in the doorway of James's study watching him the way she watched things fully, without the performance of watchfulness, the way a person watches something they have decided matters. Are you all right? She said. James looked at her. I will be, he said, tonight. She nodded. She believed him. And that the simple, undecorated fact of being believed was something James Montgomery had not felt in 11 months, not since the last time his wife had looked at him across a room and simply known without him having to perform anything that he was capable of what was coming. He straightened his jacket. Ralph McAllister was going to walk through that door in 4 hours, and after Ralph, Southampton, and after Southampton, whatever came next. Ralph McAllister arrived at 8:57 p.m., 3 minutes early. Again. James noted it the way he noted everything, now not with surprise, but with the cold cataloging attention of a man who had spent the last 18 hours recalibrating every memory he owned. Every early arrival, every warm phone call, every moment of loyalty re-examined in the new light of what it had actually been. The performance of a man who understood that the best cover was genuine affection, deployed strategically over years until it became indistinguishable from the real thing. Maybe some of it had been real. James had decided somewhere around 4 that afternoon that it didn't matter. Real or performed, the result was the same. 2 men had come through his children's window. His daughter had watched a man die on her bedroom floor. His son had said she was singing while she did it in a voice that no 7-year-old should ever have to use. That was the result. That was the only arithmetic that mattered now. Claire was already in the study when Ralph walked in. She was standing near the window and arms loose at her sides, and she positioned herself with her back to the wall in a clear sight line to the door. Not obviously, not in a way that announced itself, but James had been watching her long enough now to read her geometry. She was ready for anything Ralph might do when he understood what was happening. Ralph saw her and stopped. 1 second, just one. But James caught at the fractional recalculation behind Ralph's eyes, the rapid internal inventory of what her presence meant, what it changed, what he needed to adjust. Then the warmth came back, smooth as a tide. Didn't know this was a group conversation, Ralph said with a small, easy smile in Claire's direction. Sit down, Ralph, James said. Something in James's voice, not volume, not heat, but the specific quality of absolute stillness, made Ralph look at him directly for the first time since walking in. And what Ralph saw in James's face was apparently enough to make him sit without another word. The room was quiet for a moment. James let it be quiet. He'd learned this from 15 years of rooms like this one. The silence was not empty. The silence was the most precise instrument available. It pressed on people. It found the places where guilt lived and applied pressure there specifically without needing to be aimed. Ralph lasted 9 seconds. What's going on, James? Brighton Beach, James said. Tuesday night, 12:23 a.m., your car, Petrov's people. He placed each piece on the table between them, the way he'd placed the folders that morning, one at a time, evenly, without drama. Tell me I'm wrong. Ralph's face moved through 3 expressions in under 2 seconds. The first was surprise, genuine, or the closest thing to genuine that a man like Ralph could produce on short notice. The second was something that might have been grief or the shape of grief, which was harder to read. The third was the expression James had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting for it, the expression of a man who has decided in real time to stop performing. It was a small expression, tired, something around the eyes, something that had been held for a long time finally releasing its grip. "How long have you known?" Ralph said. "Since 4 this morning." Ralph nodded slowly. He looked at his hands for a moment. "How much?" "All of it," Claire said from the window. 5 months, the blood work, the maintenance report, the expanded plan you pitched to Petrov's people 40 days ago." She paused. "The part where you suggested they take James alive." Ralph closed his eyes just for a second, then opened them and looked at James directly, and the thing James saw there, the thing he hadn't expected and couldn't fully process, was not defiance. It was not calculation. It was exhaustion. The bone-deep exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time. "My son," Ralph said. James went still. "My son owes Petrov's people $400,000, Ralph said. "He got into business with the Brighton Beach operation 2 years ago. I didn't know about it until it was all ready. He made some decisions, James. Stupid decisions. He's 26 years old, and he made the kind of decisions that 26-year-old men make when they think they know more than they do." He stopped, his jaw tightened. "Petrov came to me 14 months ago, told me what Daniel owed, told me what would happen to Daniel if it wasn't resolved." He looked at his hands again. "I said I'd pay it. I tried. I liquidated everything I had access to. It wasn't enough. Not even close. And then Petrov's people came back with the alternative." The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. It had weight in a different direction. James looked at Ralph McAllister. 9 years, the funeral, the pallbearer, the 3 a.m. phone calls, and the warm voice and the chair he always dropped into like it was his, and understood something that he would have preferred not to understand because understanding it made everything more complicated. Ralph hadn't sold James's children because he was corrupt. He'd sold them because he was a father. "You should have come to me," James said. His voice was very quiet. "With what?" "With my son's debt to the man you've been at war with for 3 years. With the information that my kid had been running with Bratva money." Ralph looked up. "You would have handled it, James. I know exactly how you would have handled it. And Daniel would have..." He stopped. "He's my son." "My children almost died last night," James said. The words landed between them like something irretrievable. Ralph's face broke. Not dramatically, not with tears or theater, but in the specific private way a man's face breaks when he is confronted with the full consequence of a thing he knew was wrong and chose to do anyway. His jaw tightened, released. His eyes went bright and then flat. His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. "I know," he said. "I know that." A pause. "They told me it would be clean. They said the children wouldn't be harmed, that Petrov just needed a match and the procedure was minimal, and he was going to take one of my children and not bring them back," Claire said from the window. Her voice was not angry. It was simply precise. Petrov's own physician documented it. The procedure under the conditions Petrov required would not have been survivable for a 7-year-old. "They told you what you needed to hear to say yes." Ralph pressed his fist against his mouth. Said nothing. James stood up. He walked around the desk and stood in front of Ralph and looked down at him, and the thing he felt in that moment was not what he'd expected to feel. He'd expected rage, the clean-directed, manageable kind of rage that he used like a tool. What he felt instead was something much older and much harder, something that didn't have a clean application. "Where is your son right now?" James said. Ralph looked up and something moved through his face. Hope, or the desperate reflex toward hope, that human beings can't fully suppress even when they have no right to it. "He's at his apartment in Brooklyn." "Is he safe tonight? Petrov's people, do they consider him an asset or a liability at this point?" Ralph blinked. The question had clearly not been the question he was bracing for. I don't know. They might if they know the operation is compromised. They might." "Call him," James said. "Right now, tell him to leave his apartment and go to this address." He wrote something on a notepad and handed it to Ralph. "It's a property Petrov's people have no record of. He'll be safe there until this is finished." Ralph stared at the paper. "Call him," James said again. Ralph made the call. His son picked up on the second ring, and Ralph told him without explanation, without context, in the compressed shorthand of a father communicating urgency to a child to pack one bag, leave in 10 minutes, go to the address. His son asked 3 questions. Ralph said, "Please, Daniel, just go. I'll explain everything when this is over. Just go now." His voice broke on the last word, just slightly, just enough to be heard. He hung up. He looked at James. "Why?" he said. "Because your son didn't make the deal," James said. "You did." He paused. "And because you're going to help us finish this tonight." Ralph straightened. "What do you need?" "Petrov thinks he's ahead of this. He thinks you fed him the Southampton bait, and I swallowed it. He thinks he has until Wednesday." James looked at him steadily. "I need you to call his people in the next 20 minutes and confirm that the children are being moved to Southampton tomorrow. I need you to tell them everything is in place. I need them calm and confident and not looking in any other direction. And while they're looking at Wednesday, we're already in the facility," Claire said. Ralph looked at her, then back at James. "You're going tonight." "We're going tonight," James said, a long moment. Ralph looked like a man standing on the far side of a decision that had cost him everything, his loyalty, his integrity, the 9 years he'd spent building something he'd believed in and finding on the other side of it that James of Montgomery was still standing there, still making room. Not forgiving, not yet, maybe not ever, in the full sense of the word, but not abandoning him in the dark either. "I'll make the call," Ralph said. He made it. 3 minutes. Calm, detailed, convincing. The voice of a man who had been doing this for 5 months and knew how to sound certain. When he hung up, his hands were shaking slightly, which was the first time James had ever seen Ralph McAllister's hands shake. "Go to the address," James said. "Stay with your son. Don't contact anyone until I call you." Ralph stood. He stopped at the door. He didn't turn around when he spoke. "James, he stopped. "There's nothing I can say." "No," James agreed. "There isn't." Ralph left. Claire crossed the room. "Car's ready. Sasha and her partner are on the ground in Southampton. They've confirmed the guard rotation." She paused. "We have a 90-minute window starting at 1 a.m. when the north side entry will have its lowest coverage. We need to leave in 40 minutes. James looked at her, at the woman who had come into his house with one suitcase and had stood between his children and a dying man's greed and had not for a single moment in 72 hours of extraordinary pressure been anything other than exactly what the situation required. He thought about what Leo had said. "I knew she was different. She just talks to us." He thought about what she'd said about the singing. Some part of me needed to remember that what I was doing it for was worth doing. "When this is over," he said. "You keep saying that," she said. "I keep meaning it." He held her gaze. "When this is over, I need to understand who you actually are, not the file, not the operational biography, who you are." She was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable, she was almost never uncomfortable, which was itself a kind of answer. But something in her expression shifted slightly in the way the light shifts on water when a cloud moves. "When this is over," she said, "I'll tell you." She reached for her jacket. "But right now, we need to move." The drive to Southampton took 94 minutes. James sat in the back with Claire, and they didn't speak much, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said had already been said, or would wait, and both of them understood instinctively that the space before an operation was best used for clarity, not conversation. His phone buzzed once. "Marcus, kids are asleep." Leo finished the whole chapter. "He says to tell you good night." James stared at that message for a long moment, then put his phone away. They met Sasha on a dark road 3/4 of a mile from the facility. She was shorter than James had expected from Claire's description, compact and efficient looking, with close-cropped hair, and the particular stillness of someone who has spent years in positions where stillness was survival. Her partner was a tall man named Cole, who said nothing and seemed to communicate primarily through the quality of his attention. "2 guards on the north entry," Sasha said without preamble, "rotating at 1:15. That gives us a 4-minute window between the shift change guard 2 leaves before guard 1 arrives. It's a staffing overlap failure they've had since the facility opened. They've never fixed it because nobody external has ever known about it." She looked at James. "There are 8 people inside. 4 medical, including Brennan. 4 security and all armed. Petrov is in the basement suite. He cannot move without assistance. He is not a physical threat. She paused. But he has a phone at his bedside, and if he reaches it before we reach him, Petrov has a protocol in place with his people that triggers an extraction team. 15 minutes response time. Then he doesn't reach the phone, James said. Correct? Duh. Sasha looked at Claire. You've briefed him on Brennan. He knows, Claire said. Brennan will cooperate. He's been waiting for this. He may need a moment to understand that we're not Petrov's people coming for him, and he's been living under that particular fear for 6 weeks. Sasha looked at James again. When we reach the basement, I want you to let Claire and me clear the room before you enter. 30 seconds. That's all I'm asking. 30 seconds, James agreed. And when you see Petrov, she stopped. I'm not going to do anything that jeopardizes the operation, James said. Sasha looked at him with the flat, assessing gaze of someone who has seen men say exactly that sentence and then not mean it. He'll be connected to monitoring equipment. If you... I heard you, James said. 30 seconds, then I come in. I'll conduct myself appropriately until the facility is secured. He met her eyes. And then he and I will have a conversation. How that conversation ends is between him and me. Sasha looked at Claire. Claire said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. They moved at 1:14 a.m. The 4-minute window opened like a held breath. Sasha went first, then Cole, then Claire, then James, moving with the trained economy of people who had, each in different configurations in different countries, done this kind of thing before. The north entry yielded to Sasha's work in 40 seconds. The corridor inside was empty and cold. The hum of medical equipment audible from somewhere below. The first security guard they encountered was on the ground floor corridor. Cole handled him before James had fully processed that he was there. Clean fast, no sound. The second was near the stairwell. Sasha, same result. James moved through the facility with his heart rate elevated and his mind absolutely clear, which was how he had always functioned in the moments that mattered. The adrenaline didn't cloud him. It sharpened him, filed him down to the essential instrument of himself that knew exactly what it was for. The stairwell to the basement. Down. The hum of equipment growing louder. A third guard at the base of the stairs. He saw them and went for his radio, and Claire was on him before the radio reached his mouth, and the whole sequence reach intercept neutralized took less than 4 seconds. And James counted them because counting was something to do other than feel the thing that was building in his chest as they moved toward the door at the end of the corridor. The medical suite. Sasha held up her hand. 30 seconds. She and Claire went through the door. James stood in the corridor and listened and counted and breathed. He heard a man's voice, startled, then frightened, then something that shifted into something else. Irish accent. Oh, God. Oh, thank God. I didn't think anyone was. How did you, Brennan? Then Claire's voice low and steady. You're safe. We need you to step to the far wall and stay there. Can you do that? A shuffling, a monitor alarm that Cole silenced from the doorway. More shuffling. 30 seconds. James walked through the door. The room was small and overlit and smelled of antiseptic, and something underneath the antiseptic that James recognized as illness, the particular organic smell of a body failing at the cellular level. There was a man in the far corner pressing himself against the wall with his hands up, middle-aged, unshaven, wearing a white coat over civilian clothes, Brennan clearly visibly terrified and visibly relieved in equal measure. And in the center of the room, in a medical bed surrounded by monitors and IV lines, and the infrastructure of a life being extended by extraordinary effort, was Viktor Petrov. He was smaller than James had expected. That was the first thing. Not physically small, he was a large-framed man, or had been the architecture of former size still visible in his shoulders and jaw, but diminished. The illness had taken something from his presence that no amount of power or money had been able to replace. He was perhaps 65 gray, drawn with the particular gauntness of someone who has been fighting something internal and losing for a long time. He looked at James, his eyes were sharp. Whatever the illness had taken from his body, it hadn't touched the intelligence in those eyes. They were the eyes of a man who had built something real and ruthless and lasting, and who recognized in the person standing in front of him a version of that same quality. Mr. Montgomery, Petrov said. His voice was weaker than his eyes, slightly breathless, but controlled. I expected you sooner. I wanted to be thorough, James said. You used Ralph. Not a question, a piece of analysis delivered with something that was almost professional appreciation. He used himself, James said. I just redirected the application. Petrov looked past James at Claire and Sasha standing behind him. Something moved through his expression, not fear but a reassessment. The recalculation of a man who had understood perhaps for the first time that the gap between what he'd known and what he hadn't known was significantly larger than he'd believed. Your nanny, Petrov said. Among other things, James said. Petrov looked back at him. I want you to understand something, he said. I have 3 grandchildren, 2 girls and a boy. The boy is 6. When I am gone, he stopped. A brief involuntary pause that James recognized as pain physical, arriving without schedule. Petrov absorbed it the way men who have been managing pain for a long time absorb it, privately, efficiently. When I am gone, what I built will go with me unless I survive long enough to secure it properly. I am not a man who made this decision lightly. You targeted 7-year-old children, James said. I targeted a medical match. The children were, say it, James said, very quietly. Say what you intended, out loud, in this room. Petrov looked at him for a long moment, and then in the way that men who are dying sometimes arrive at a particular kind of honesty that living men can afford to avoid, he said, I intended to save my life at the cost of one of yours. I understood what that meant. I chose to proceed. The room was absolutely still. Your grandchildren, James said, 2 girls and a boy. Yes. My children have no mother, James said. She died 11 months ago. They have nightmares. My son woke up 3 times a week for the first 2 months calling for her. My daughter leaves drawings of her on my desk because someone told her it would help. He paused. They are 7 years old and they have already lost more than any child should lose. And you looked at all of that, and decided they could lose more, that they were available to lose more. Petrov said nothing. The facility is compromised, James said. Your operation is finished. Your people in Brighton Beach will be managed separately. That's already in motion. He looked at the monitors, at the IV lines, at the equipment that was doing with machinery what Petrov's body could no longer do for itself. Dr. Brennan is going home. Your medical team will be escorted out. Your security is already down. Petrov's jaw tightened. And me. You, boss, James said, are going to call your people and tell them the Southampton operation is terminated. Tell them to stand down. All of them. He held Petrov's gaze. And then you are going to understand very clearly that the infrastructure you built on this coast is no longer yours. Whatever you are going to leave your grandchildren, you've already spent it. You're not going to kill me, Petrov said. And it wasn't a question, and it wasn't a plea. It was an analysis. You're dying, James said. The illness you were trying to cure is going to kill you in 4 months, whether I act or not. Killing you tonight would be a mercy I haven't decided you deserve. He paused. But I want to be very clear, the next person you send in the direction of my family, for any reason in any form, will be the last decision you ever make. Not because I'll come here, because I won't have to. Do you understand me? Petrov looked at him for a long time. The monitors beeped steadily around him. And then Viktor Petrov, who had built an empire on the foundation of fear, who had deployed that fear for 40 years against anyone who challenged him, who had sat across from men far more physically dangerous than James Montgomery, and made them fold, did something James had not seen coming. He looked at the ceiling. He closed his eyes briefly. And when he opened them, what James saw was not defeat exactly. It was the particular enormous tiredness of a man who has been fighting for a very long time and has finally in this room at this moment run completely out of runway. I understand you, Petrov said. He reached for the phone beside his bed. Claire moved forward 1 step and James held up his hand without looking at her, and she stopped. He held Petrov's gaze while the old man dialed and listened while Viktor Petrov told his people in clipped Russian that Southampton was finished, that they were to stand down, that he would explain when he could. He ended the call. He set the phone down. James stood there for another moment, not because anything further needed to be said, but because some moments require presence, require being fully in them before moving through them, and this was one of those. Then he turned him. Claire was watching him with that expression he was beginning to understand, not blank, not closed, but the expression of someone who is taking careful note of who a person actually is. Not who they perform themselves to be, who they actually are in the moment when the decision is hardest and the cost is clearest, and all the noise has been stripped away. Brennan was already moving toward the door. Sasha had a hand on his shoulder, guiding him, her voice low and reassuring in his ear. Cole was on the stairs, clearing the exit. Claire fell into step beside James as he moved toward the door. "That was not what I expected," she said quietly. "What did you expect?" She glanced at him. "I expected you to make a different choice." "I thought about it," James said. "I know." They moved up the stairs and through the corridor, and out through the north entry and into the cold Southampton night, and the air was clean and sharp, and James breathed it in and thought about Leo sleeping in a safe house with a book on his chest and Lily with her hands folded, the way her mother used to fold hers, and Ralph McAllister sitting in an unfamiliar room with his son trying to figure out what the morning would bring, and Victor Petrov alone in a basement full of machines calling his people and telling them it was over. His phone buzzed. "Marcus." Leo woke up. "Asked if you were okay." I told him yes. He said, "Tell Dad Claire probably handled it." James stopped walking for one moment. Just one. Then he looked at Claire. "My son says you probably handled it," he said. Something moved across her face. Something that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. "Smart kid," she said. "He gets it from his mother," James said. They walked toward their car, and the night was cold and clear above them. And somewhere behind them, a man was dying in a room full of machines. And somewhere ahead of them, two children were sleeping. And the space between those two facts was the exact territory in which James Montgomery now found himself. Not safe, not finished, not absolved of the cost of the life he'd built, but present. Awake, able for the first time in 11 months to feel the cold of the air and call it a beginning. The drive back from Southampton took 94 minutes, and James spent most of it staring at his phone without touching it. Not because there was nothing to do, there was a great deal to do, and the list of it was already assembling itself in the back of his mind with the automatic, systematic efficiency that had kept him alive and operational for 15 years. Ralph, the Brighton Beach Network. The legal architecture of dismantling Petrov's East Coast holdings before someone else moved to absorb them. Brennan, who would need to disappear under a new identity before Petrov's people recovered their organizational coherence enough to consider him a liability. All of it was there waiting, organized and patient. But James didn't reach for any of it. He sat in the back of the car and looked at his phone and thought about a text message that said Leo woke up. He said, "Tell Dad Claire probably handled it." He thought about a 7-year-old boy who had watched a man die on his bedroom floor and whose primary response 20 hours later was faith, not fear. Faith. In a woman he'd known for 8 weeks who had sat on the edge of his bed and told him, "You can't be scared and focused at the same time. You have to choose." James looked at Claire sitting beside him in the dark of the car. She was looking out the window. Not at her phone, not at her hands, not running the operational inventory the way James was running it. Just looking at the dark road moving past with the particular stillness that he had come to understand was not absence, but presence, a person fully occupying the moment they were in, rather than reaching ahead into the next one. "You should sleep," she said without turning from the window. "I'll sleep when the children are home." She turned then. "They're safe, James." "I know they're safe. I'll sleep when they're home." He paused. "You said you'd tell me when it was over." She looked at him for a moment. "It's not entirely over. The acute part is." She was quiet for a few seconds. The car moved through the dark. Then, "My real name is Claire." That part was true. A small pause. "Bennett wasn't. It's Morrow. Claire Morrow." "Morrow, I know," James repeated. "My father was State Department. Actual State Department, not cover. He spent 20 years moving through Eastern European postings in the 80s and 90s. I grew up in 4 countries before I was 16. I spoke Russian before I spoke it with an accent people couldn't place." She turned back to the window briefly, then back to him. "When I was 22, I was recruited by a private intelligence firm that operated under State Department contract. I spent 8 years doing what I did tonight in different rooms for different reasons, with different people in the beds." She said it plainly, without the performance of casualness and without the performance of weight. Just facts delivered to someone she'd decided deserved them. "I left 5 years ago, or I tried to leave. You don't entirely leave. There's always one more thing, one more placement, one more situation where someone decides you're the specific instrument required. This placement," James said. This placement came 6 weeks ago. The intelligence about Petrov's targeting of your family was credible, and the timeline was compressed, and I was, she paused. I was the person they called, because of the Eastern European background, because of my history with Petrov's operation, because I could pass as a nanny in a way that someone without a particular kind of composure couldn't. She met his eyes. And because I was available, because I had been available for 2 years, which is its own kind of answer about where my life was. Why were you available? Something shifted in her expression. Not pain exactly, she processed things too efficiently for pain to sit on the surface, but the shadow of it. The shape of something that had been worked through but not forgotten. I lost someone, she said, operational. 3 years ago in Kiev. A partner. We'd been working together for 4 years. She stopped. Then simply, he didn't come back from something I sent him into. James looked at her. I spent a year believing it was my miscalculation, she said. It wasn't the intelligence we'd been given was deliberately corrupted, and there was nothing I could have done differently with what I had. But a year is a long time to believe something, and what you believe for a year changes you in ways that take longer than a year to unchange. She looked at her hands briefly. So I was available. And when they called, I came. Because doing the work is the only thing I know that interrupts the other thing. James understood this with a completeness that surprised him, not intellectually, not as an idea he could examine and agree with, but from the inside, from the place where you spend 11 months sitting in a study at 3 in the morning. Because sleep means stopping, and stopping means arriving fully in the place where the grief lives. And arriving fully in that place feels unsurvivable, even when you know technically that you have survived it so far. The singing, he said, not for the first time, but differently this time. She looked at him, waiting. You told me it was for the children, to calm them, to remind yourself what you were doing it for. He held her gaze. Was there more to it? A long pause. Long enough to be honest rather than considered. When I'm in a moment where I've had to, she stopped, started again. There's a thing that happens in those moments where the silence afterward is very loud. And if you let the loud silence be the only thing it takes something from you that you don't get back easily. She paused. Music fills the silence. It doesn't fix anything, but it holds the space so the space doesn't hollow out. James nodded slowly. Mikhail, he said. Her partner's name, she hadn't said it, but it was suddenly present in the car, the shape of an unspoken name. She looked at him sharply. You said he, James said, and the way you said it. She was quiet for a moment. Then Mikhail Ose. He was the best person I've ever worked with, and the best person I ever knew. Both of those things were true simultaneously, which is rarer than it sounds. Yes, James said, it is. They looked at each other in the moving dark, and neither of them said anything further because neither of them needed to. Two people who had each lost someone irreplaceable, who had each found in the doing of difficult and necessary things the only path they knew through the loss, sitting in a car in the small hours of a Wednesday morning with the acute part over and the long part still ahead. The car pulled through the gates of the safe house property at 4:12 a.m. Marcus met them at the door. He took one look at James and said, They're asleep, both of them. Leo made it to about 2 before he crashed. Lily's been out since 11. He looked at Claire. You okay? Fine, she said. Sasha, check in. Brennan is in transit, Claire said. Cole has him. He'll be placed by morning. Marcus nodded. He had the specific quality of a man who had worked for James long enough to have seen the end of several very difficult situations and understood that the end of a situation and the resolution of a situation were related but not identical. He said nothing further and stepped aside. James walked down the hall to the room where his children were sleeping. He pushed the door open and stood in the doorframe for a moment, the way he had stood in a different doorframe 24 hours ago with a pistol in his hand and his heart trying to exit his chest. This was different. Leo was on his back with one arm thrown over his face, the old book Claire had been reading to them. Open face down on the bed beside him, he'd fallen asleep mid-chapter. Apparently the way his mother used to fall asleep mid-chapter tea. Book held open as long as possible until gravity won. Lily was curled on her side, facing the wall with her hands tucked under her cheek. in the precise position Catherine had always slept in, so precisely that James had to stop himself the first night after the funeral from going to check that it was Lily and not a dream. He crossed the room and closed Leo's book gently and set it on the nightstand. He pulled the blanket up on Lily's shoulder. He stood between their beds for a moment, just a moment, and breathed. Then he walked back to the door and found Claire standing in the hallway watching him with that expression she had, the one that wasn't performing anything. "Come and have coffee," she said, "or try to sleep. Either way, stop standing in doorways." He almost smiled. Almost. "Is that an order?" "It's a recommendation from someone who has watched you not sleep for 24 hours. I told you I slept when—" "They're home," she said, "or close enough. Come have coffee." He came and had coffee. They sat in the kitchen of a house that wasn't his, at a table that wasn't his, with mugs that belonged to a life Claire had constructed under a name that wasn't hers. And the coffee was very good, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need to be managed or filled. "What happens now," James said, "with Petrov, with the network?" "Petrov's organization will fracture without him. It already started fracturing when he got sick. There are 3 factions within the Brighton Beach operation who've been waiting for an opportunity. By the time he dies, they'll be too busy competing with each other to reconstitute what he had." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "Your lawyers will need to move quickly on the property documentation. There are 4 assets that will go into a contested zone within the next 60 days if someone doesn't establish prior claim correctly. I can give you the file, the specifics." "You have a file on my property assets. I have a file on everything that touches Petrov's operation," she said, with the slight implication of obviously that she deployed occasionally and that James had decided he found more entertaining than he expected to. "It was necessary for the placement." "Right," he looked at her. "And Ralph." The words sat between them for a moment. "That's your decision," Claire said. "I have a view on it if you want it." "I want it." Ralph made a catastrophic choice under unbearable pressure with no good options. She held his gaze. "That doesn't excuse it, but it contextualizes it. He spent 5 months living in the space between what he did and who he thought he was, and that space is its own punishment, and it will be for a long time." She paused. "His son has nothing to do with it. The boy made stupid decisions with money, not moral ones. He doesn't know what his father did." "You think I should let Ralph walk," James said. "I think you should decide what justice means in a case where the man who wronged you did it because he was trying to save his child," she said, "and where you would have burned the world down for the same reason." James looked at his coffee. He thought about the image from 4 that morning, Ralph's car, Brighton Beach, the photograph. He thought about Ralph's voice on the phone to Daniel, "Please just go. I'll explain everything when this is over." He thought about the way Ralph's hands had shaken after making the call that turned the operation around. The first time in 9 years he'd seen those hands shake. "He's done," James said. "He's out. No role, no access, nothing. His son gets a clean break separate from this entirely. But Ralph is finished in my world." He paused. "That's not mercy. That's the most I can do." "It's enough," Claire said. The first light came through the kitchen window at 5:47 a.m. Gray and tentative, the specific quality of early October light that doesn't commit to warmth yet, but suggests it might be willing to discuss it. James watched it happen with the quality of attention he hadn't given to ordinary things in 11 months, the way it moved across the table, the way it changed the color of the coffee in his mug, from dark to something with brown in it, the way it found Claire's face and made her look tired and real, and completely unguarded in a way she probably didn't know she looked. "You're staring," she said without looking up from her own coffee. "I'm thinking." "About what?" "About what comes next." He set down his mug. "You were a placement, a contracted placement, with a specific operational objective. The objective is complete." He looked at her directly. "What does that mean for you? What does your firm expect you to do now?" She was quiet for a moment. "They expect me to file a completion report and close the contract and make myself available for the next placement." She said it evenly, but James had become over the last 48 hours sufficiently calibrated to Claire Morrow's particular frequencies to hear what lived underneath the evenness. "And what do you expect?" he said. She looked at him, a long, steady look, the kind she gave things she was deciding how honestly to engage with. I expect, she said carefully, that this particular situation has some unresolved elements that make a clean closure complicated. Such as? Such as the fact that Petrov's organization will fracture but not disappear, and whoever emerges from the fracture will know that your family was a target and will need to be watched. She paused. Such as the fact that you are a man who has been operating blind to a specific category of threat for at least 5 months, and the correction of that blindness requires either a sustained intelligence capacity or a very large amount of trust in people who may or may not be Ralph's. Another pause. Such as the fact that your children know me, and Leo told me 2 days ago that I'm the only adult besides Marcus who doesn't talk to them like they're made of glass, and I don't think that's something he said casually. James looked at her. Those are operational reasons. Yes. Are there non-operational ones? The silence lasted 4 full seconds, which in Claire Morrow's economy of response was the equivalent of a much longer answer. There might be, she said. I'm still determining the nature of them. That's a careful answer. You're a careful situation, she said. And then with the slight softening that she allowed herself in moments she had apparently decided were earned, you're also a good man, which I didn't build into my operational assumptions and which has complicated several things considerably. James looked at her for a long moment, across the table, in the early gray light, with 2 sleeping children down the hall and its wreckage of the last 48 hours settling around them like dust after a building comes down. Stay, he said. She held his gaze. In what capacity? In whatever capacity makes sense, he said. Not as a placement, not under contract. In whatever capacity is honest. He paused. The children need stability. I need someone I can trust who is actually trustworthy, which turns out to be a narrower category than I understood. He paused again. And I would like you to stay. Those are 3 separate reasons, and only one of them is operational. Claire looked at her coffee, then at the window, then at him. I'll need to close the contract properly, she said. File the completion report. Make it clean. How long does that take? A week? Maybe 2. And then, she looked at him steadily. And then I'll come back, she said, and we'll figure out the rest of it as it develops, which is the honest answer, and I don't have a more certain one than that. That's enough, James said. The sound of feet on the hallway floor. Small, quick feet, the kind that don't fully commit to being quiet because they're too excited to manage the full discipline of it. Then Leo appeared in the kitchen doorway in his pajamas, with his hair going 4 directions and the old book under his arm, because apparently he'd woken up and brought it with him as a matter of course. He looked at James, then at Claire, then back at James, the device. Did you fix it? He said. Yes, James said. Is the man going to come back? No. Leo processed this with the focused economy of a person who has already asked the important questions and is now ready to move forward. Then he crossed the kitchen and climbed into the chair next to Claire and put the book on the table between them. You didn't finish the chapter, he said to her. Claire looked at the book, then at Leo. Something moved across her face, something she didn't try to manage or contain, something that arrived fully and was allowed to be fully there in the way that things that matter don't stay neatly managed. No, she said, I didn't. Do you want to finish it now before Lily wakes up so she doesn't hear the ending? Claire looked at James across the table. He looked back at her, and the morning light was coming more confidently now, committing a little more to the warmth it had been considering, and his son was sitting between them with a book under his arm, asking a question that had nothing to do with the last 48 hours and everything to do with what came after them. Yes, Claire said. She reached for the book. I want to finish it. Lily appeared in the doorway 7 minutes into the chapter. She stood there for a moment in her pajamas, hair sleep-flattened, assessing the scene with the particular thoroughness she brought to every situation she walked into fresh. Her father at the table, Claire reading aloud, Leo listening with his chin in his hands. She crossed the room and climbed into James's lap without asking and leaned her head against his chest and listened. James put his arm around his daughter and closed his eyes for a moment, just a moment, and listened to Claire Morrow reading a story about maps and adventure and the kind of journey that changes the people who take it. And the morning came through the window, clean and full, and outside the city was waking up to a Wednesday that would carry the ordinary requirements of ordinary life. And in this kitchen, in a house that belonged to nobody's real name, a family that was not yet entirely sure of its own shape was sitting at a table, letting itself be held together by the sound of a voice, reading words that someone else had written a long time ago about courage and distance and what it means to finally, after everything, arrive somewhere. Lily said without lifting her head from James's chest, "Is Claire staying?" James looked at Claire. Claire had paused in the reading. She looked at Lily, then at James, then back at the book. "For a while," she said. Lily considered this. "How long is a while?" "Long enough," Claire said. Lily appeared to accept this as an adequate answer because she closed her eyes and settled more firmly against her father's chest. And Claire turned the page and kept reading, and Leo reached across the table and turned it back, because he'd missed a line and wanted it read again. And Claire said Leo with the exact intonation of a person who has been managing a specific small person's particular specific habits long enough to have developed a specific response to them. And Leo said what it was a good line, and James opened his eyes and looked at his children and looked at this woman who had come into his house with one suitcase and no small talk and had stood between his family and the thing that was coming for them without hesitating, without asking to be thanked, without asking for anything at all. He thought about Catherine. He thought about the Florence clock on his study wall and the warm scotch he'd poured into the sink in the 11 months of not sleeping, and the way grief had made him blind to Ralph and blind to the east window and blind to the category of threat he hadn't been watching. He thought about what Catherine would say if she could see this kitchen right now, this improbable, difficult, honest kitchen, with its gray morning light and its borrowed mugs and its children who were still here, still breathing, still asking for chapters to be read and lines to be repeated. He thought she would say, "Good." Just that. In the way she'd said it, when things that mattered worked out, not with relief, not with surprise, but with the simple, weighty satisfaction of someone who believed that things that mattered were worth fighting for and was never surprised when the fight turned out to be worth it. Good. James Montgomery, who had not slept a full night in 11 months, who had buried his wife and rebuilt his empire around the shape of her absence, who had walked into his children's room at 3 a.m. with a pistol in his hand and found something he wasn't expecting. Not a threat, but a turning point. A woman with a blade and a song and the specific, extraordinary quality of someone who chose focus over fear, felt the thing that had been locked behind his sternum for 11 months begin very slowly and without theater to move. Not gone, not resolved, not the clean closure that people who haven't lived in grief tend to believe grief eventually becomes, but moving. The way a river moves over time through stone, not by force, but by the steady, patient insistence of itself. 2 weeks later, Claire Morrow closed her contract, filed her completion report, and came back. She brought one suitcase, the same one. Leo held the door open and said with the gravity of someone who had been thinking about what to say and had arrived at the correct thing, "Your room's the same as before. I didn't touch anything." Claire looked at him. "Thank you, Leo." "Lily moved your book," Leo said. "She says she didn't, but she did." "Leo," Lily said from somewhere down the hall. "You did," Leo called back and looked at Claire with the expression of a person outsourcing a grievance to a more appropriate authority. Claire smiled, the full version. The one James had seen twice in 48 hours, and that turned out, up close in good light, to be the kind of thing that changed the atmosphere of whatever room it appeared in. She stepped through the door. James took the suitcase. She let him. And the door closed behind her, and the house was full of the particular warm noise of 2 children arguing about a book across a hallway, while an October afternoon came through the windows and made everything look like something worth keeping. And James Montgomery set the suitcase down and understood not as an idea, not as a resolution, but as a simple, solid, undeniable fact that the man who had not slept for 11 months was standing in a house that was against considerable odds and, by remarkable means, still standing, still his, still full, still capable of being in the specific, difficult, irreplaceable way of things that have been through something real and survived at a home.